A simple gesture can change a life. When a homeless man returns a lost wallet, he doesn't imagine that this decision will transform his destiny. But the businessman who received it saw something greater. And what happened next, no one could have predicted. The sun had barely risen when Richard Adams woke up, startled by the noise of the first buses passing along Fifth Avenue. The cardboard he used as a mattress was damp from the night's dew, but he was already used to that sensation. His 45 years carried stories that few would imagine when passing by him on that busy sidewalk. As he got up, adjusting the worn-out jacket he had received from a local shopkeeper, Richard observed the city awakening. It was fascinating how New York could be so grand and so lonely at the same time. Executives were beginning their daily procession, carrying important briefcases and distant gazes, lost in urgent calls and messages. "Good morning," he mumbled to a lady passing by hurriedly, but as usual he received no response. Richard didn't care about that anymore. After 3 years living on the streets, he had learned that invisibility was part of his routine. It hadn't always been like this, of course. There was a time when he too wore well-pressed suits and carried a briefcase, full of financial reports. That morning, something in the air seemed different. Maybe it was the smell of coffee coming from the corner bakery, or maybe it was just his imagination playing tricks. Anna, the young attendant who sometimes saved him day-old bread, waved discreetly through the window. It was then that his eyes caught an unusual movement. A tall man wearing an impeccable navy blue suit was walking hurriedly while talking on his cell phone. His countenance carried that typical expression of someone who carries the weight of the world on their shoulders. It was at that moment it happened. The wallet slipped from the poorly closed pocket of his jacket, falling silently on the sidewalk. Richard observed the scene in slow motion. The brown leather wallet, probably Italian, lay on the ground like a temptation of fate. For a brief moment, all his problems seemed to have a solution there, just a few meters away. All he had to do was take it and disappear, as many would do in his situation. But something inside him, something that not even the toughest years had managed to erase, made him act differently. He got up with an agility that would surprise many and ran after the executive, who was almost turning the corner. "Sir! Sir!" shouted Richard, his voice hoarse from lack of use. The executive kept walking, absorbed in his phone conversation. It took a second attempt louder. "Sir! Your wallet!" Finally, the man turned around. It was Frank Thompson, although Richard didn't know his name yet. His green eyes showed confusion first, then surprise, upon seeing who was calling him. Instinctively, he patted the pocket of his jacket, confirming that he had indeed lost something. You found my wallet?" asked Frank, still holding the cell phone to his ear, where a voice continued talking about numbers and reports. Richard extended the wallet with slightly trembling hands, not because of the value that might be inside it, but for the simple fact of being so close to someone who represented everything he once was. The scent of imported perfume brought memories of his old life, memories he tried to keep locked away in some safe place in his mind. Frank took the wallet with an expression difficult to decipher. He opened it quickly, checking its contents. All the cards were there, as well as the $2,000 in cash he had withdrawn the day before. His gaze returned to Richard, this time truly seeing him. "Thank you," he said simply, hanging up the call without saying goodbye to whoever was on the other end of the line. He stood there as if wanting to say something more, but the words didn't come. He just nodded and started walking again, this time more slowly, as if something in his usual rush had been altered. Richard returned to his spot on the sidewalk, sitting down again on the cardboard. Anna, from the bakery, had observed the whole scene and was now smiling at him, a smile different from the usual, loaded with something that seemed like pride. Minutes later, she crossed the street, bringing him a hot coffee and a buttered roll. "You're a good person, Mr. Richard," she said, leaving the coffee beside him. "Not everyone would do what you did." He just smiled in response, blowing on the hot coffee before taking a sip. The liquid went down, burning his throat, but it was a welcome warmth. Richard didn't know it, but that simple act of honesty was about to trigger a series of events that would change not only his life but that of many other people. The day continued its normal course. Executives passed by hurriedly, some talking to themselves, others glued to their phones. Street vendors set up their stalls, and the sound of the city gradually grew. But something had changed in the universe. A small gear had moved in a different direction, and its consequences were yet to come. Frank Thompson, sitting in his office on the 30th floor of one of the country's largest investment banks, couldn't concentrate on the spreadsheets on his screen. His mind kept returning to that unusual encounter. As CEO of one of the largest companies in the country, he was used to dealing with astronomical numbers and decisions that affected thousands of lives, but there was something in that simple gesture that intrigued him deeply. Meanwhile, Richard shared his bread with Joe, another homeless man who always sat near the newsstand. He didn't tell about the wallet incident. Some things are better kept to oneself. The sun was already high in the sky, and the city was buzzing in its frantic routine. "Today feels different," Joe commented, chewing his piece of bread. Richard just nodded, his thoughts wandering to a distant time when he too occupied luxurious offices and made important decisions. It was funny how life took turns. There he was, having done something that many in his former position might not have done. The day passed and Richard maintained his usual routine. He talked with some local merchants, helped Mrs. Wilson from the flower shop organize her pots, and observed the city in its chaotic ballet of people and automobiles. But there was something different in the air, a feeling he couldn't explain. As evening fell, when the sun was beginning to hide among the skyscrapers, Richard noticed a familiar movement. The same man from the wallet was coming back, but this time his pace was slower, purposeful. Frank stopped a few meters away, observing him with a thoughtful expression. Richard felt a chill in his stomach. In his years on the streets, he had learned to read people, and something told him that this encounter wouldn't be a simple, formal thank you. The universe, in its mysterious wisdom, had put two unlikely people on a collision course, and the consequences of this meeting were about to unfold in ways that neither of them could imagine. Frank Thompson crossed the street with determined steps, ignoring the messages that kept arriving on his cell phone. After a whole day reflecting on the morning encounter, something compelled him to return to that spot. In his 20 years as an executive, he had rarely witnessed an act of such integrity. "Can we talk for a bit?" he asked, stopping in front of Richard. His tone was different from the morning, softer, almost hesitant. Richard raised his eyes, surprised by the executive's return. "Of course, sir," he replied, instinctively straightening up. Frank looked around, feeling out of place in his own city. A few meters away, hurried people passed without noticing the unusual scene unfolding. "Is there somewhere we can talk more quietly?" Anna, who was watching everything from the bakery, made an inviting gesture. Frank understood and, with a nod, invited Richard to accompany him there. The contrast between the two men was evident, one in his impeccable Italian suit, the other in clothes worn by time. But there was something in their gazes that brought them closer, a shared dignity that transcended appearances. Seated at a discreet table in the back of the bakery, with two steaming cups of coffee in front of them, the initial silence was broken by Frank. "You know, I spent the whole day thinking about what happened this morning. There was over $2,000 in my wallet." Richard stirred the coffee slowly, a habit that had remained from his executive days. "Money isn't everything, sir. Some things are more important." The answer caught Frank by surprise. It wasn't the kind of philosophy he expected to hear from someone living on the streets. "You haven't always lived on the streets, have you?" A sad smile crossed Richard's face. "No, I haven't. I've been on the other side of the counter, so to speak. I was the financial director of a medium-sized company. I had everything: my own house, a new car, a fat bank account." Frank leaned forward, interested. "What happened?" "Life happened," Richard replied, his eyes fixed on the coffee cup. "It started with a series of wrong investments. I trusted the wrong people too much. When I realized, I was drowning in debt. My wife couldn't handle the pressure and decided to leave. She took our daughter, Laura, who was only 12 at the time." Richard's voice faltered slightly at the mention of his daughter. Frank noticed that, despite the adversities, the man maintained a dignified posture, an eloquence that revealed his past. "I tried to start over, but the financial market can be ruthless. My name was tarnished. Doors started to close. One day I couldn't pay the rent anymore. After that, it was just a matter of time until you ended up on the streets." Frank completed softly. Richard nodded. 3 years have passed. My daughter must be 15 now. Sometimes when I see teenagers passing by with their school backpacks, I wonder how she is, if she still remembers her dad. Anna, who occasionally passed by the table to refill the coffee cups, couldn't hide her emotion as she listened to the story. Frank, in turn, maintained a reflective silence, processing every word. "You know what's most ironic?" continued Richard. "Even after everything, I haven't lost my education, my knowledge. I still read the newspapers I find, keeping up with the financial market. Old habits die hard." Frank took a business card from his pocket and placed it on the table. "Richard, I'll be direct. I need someone with experience in financial analysis for a special project, someone who understands not just numbers, but people, someone who, despite the most adverse circumstances, maintains their integrity." Richard looked at the card in disbelief. On it, in golden letters, it read, "Frank Thompson, CEO, Thompson Investments." "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering an opportunity," Frank corrected. "What you do with it will depend entirely on you. I can provide a place to stay temporarily, appropriate clothes, and an initial salary compatible with the market. In exchange, I want your experience and, most importantly, your unique perspective on life." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Richard took the card with trembling hands, running his fingers over the embossed letters. Years of dreams and hopes seemed to converge on that moment. "Why are you doing this?" he finally asked. Frank smiled, a genuine smile he rarely displayed in his corporate meetings. "Because sometimes we need a reminder that the world still has good people. You gave me that reminder this morning. Now, I want to give back not just to you, but to create something bigger." Anna, who could no longer contain her curiosity, approached the table again. "Mr. Richard, this is incredible. It's the chance you've been waiting for." Richard looked out the bakery window, observing the movement on the street where he had spent the last 3 years. He saw Joe, his sidewalk companion, waving from afar. He saw the hurried executives, people immersed in their own worlds. And for the first time in a long time, he saw hope. "When do I start?" he asked, turning to Frank. "Tomorrow, if you're willing. First, we'll take care of your accommodation and the basics you need. Then you'll get to know the company, and we'll start working on the project." As they settled the details, the sun was setting over New York, painting the sky in orange hues. In the bakery, Anna smiled as she served more coffee, a silent witness to a transformation that was just beginning. Frank made some calls, arranging a room in a hotel near the office. Richard listened attentively to each instruction, every detail of what would be his new routine. In his mind, however, his thoughts wandered to Laura, his daughter. Maybe, just maybe, this fresh start could lead him back to her. Night had fallen when the two men said goodbye. Richard, with Frank's card secure in his pocket and a backpack with the few belongings he owned, prepared for his first night in a real bed after 3 years. Frank, in turn, headed to his imported car with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. That night, as the city continued its frantic rhythm, 2 lives that seemed so distant began to intertwine in ways that neither could have predicted. Fate, in its mysterious wisdom, had created an unlikely connection that was about to transform not only their lives but those of many others. The first morning at the hotel was surreal for Richard. The bathroom mirror reflected an image he barely recognized: trimmed hair and beard, new clothes that Frank had provided the night before. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie, a gesture he hadn't made in so long, but which his body seemed to instinctively remember. The hotel breakfast seemed like a feast fit for kings. Richard served himself moderately, fighting against the urge to save food for later, a habit acquired on the streets that he would need to unlearn. Each bite was savored with gratitude. Each sip of coffee was a reminder that this wasn't a dream. At 7:45, as agreed, Frank was waiting for him in the lobby. "Ready for the first day?" he asked with an encouraging smile. "Honestly, I'm terrified," Richard replied, his sincerity surprising them both. The journey to Thompson Investments was made in an executive car with a driver. Richard observed the city through the tinted windows, seeing it now from a completely different perspective. They passed by the sidewalk where he had been sleeping until yesterday. Joe was already there, and for a moment Richard felt a pang of guilt for his sudden change of fortune. The company building was an imposing structure of glass and steel that rose in the financial heart of New York. In the reception, well-dressed employees transited hurriedly, some casting curious glances at the CEO's new companion. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," greeted the receptionist. "The meeting room on the 30th floor is prepared as requested." In the elevator, Frank explained, "Before meeting the rest of the team, I need to tell you more about the project I have in mind. It's something different from what we usually do here." The meeting room had a panoramic view of the city. Richard found himself hypnotized by the landscape, remembering how many times he had observed those same buildings from below, dreaming of a fresh start. "Please, have a seat," Frank indicated, closing the door. "What I'm going to tell you now is something I've been planning for some time, but I never found the right person to execute it." Richard adjusted himself in the leather chair, trying to appear more confident than he really felt. Frank opened his laptop and projected some graphs on the room's screen. "Thompson Investments is one of the largest investment companies in the country," Frank began. "We manage fortunes, make millionaire mergers, generate extraordinary profits. But yesterday when you returned that wallet to me, I realized it was time to do something different." He paused, organizing his thoughts. "I want to create a social and professional reintegration program, not just charity, but a project that really transforms lives, and I want you to lead it." Richard blinked a few times, processing the information. "Me? But why me?" "Because you've lived both sides," Frank replied, leaning forward. "You know the corporate world and you know the reality of the streets. More importantly, you maintained your integrity even in the worst circumstances. I can't think of anyone better to identify people with potential and help them rebuild their lives." The proposal was audacious. Frank explained that he would allocate a significant part of the company's profits to the project, which would include not only job opportunities, but also temporary housing, professional training, and psychological support. "Of course, you won't be alone," Frank continued. "I've assembled a support team, including social workers and psychologists, but I need someone who understands numbers and people, someone who can turn this dream into reality." Richard felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "It's an ambitious project," he commented, analyzing the projected numbers. "But I see you've already thought about many details." "Actually, your arrival was the catalyst that was missing," Frank smiled. "Sometimes we need a sign from the universe to set things in motion." At that moment, a soft knock on the door interrupted the conversation. An elegant woman, appearing to be about 40 years old, entered the room. "Ah, Mary! Perfect timing!" Frank stood up. "Richard, this is Mary Fields, our Human Resources Director. She will be fundamental to the project." Mary extended her hand with a welcoming smile. "Frank told me about you. Welcome to the team." The morning passed in meetings and presentations. Richard learned every detail of the project, making meticulous notes and offering valuable insights based on his experience. His analytical mind, dormant for so long, came back to life with renewed vigor. During lunch, in the building's executive restaurant, Mary shared more details about the company and the team. Richard listened attentively, absorbing every piece of information, every nuance of the corporate culture he would need to navigate. "You know, Richard," Mary commented between bites, "when Frank first told me about this idea, I thought he was crazy. But after meeting you, I'm starting to believe it might work." Richard smiled, but his thoughts drifted to Joe and the others who were still on the streets. "It won't be easy," he replied. "Many people have lost not just their material possessions, but also hope. Regaining that is the biggest challenge." In the afternoon, Frank took him to see what would be his office, a modest but comfortable room, with a view of the city. While organizing his desk, Richard found an envelope with his name on it. "Your first salary advance," Frank explained. "I thought you might need some basic things." Richard held the envelope reverently. "Thank you, but Isn't it too much? It's fair, Frank answered simply. Now how about we continue with the introductions? We have a lot of work ahead of us. The rest of the afternoon was dedicated to meeting more team members and starting to structure the project. Richard surprised everyone with his analytical skills and practical suggestions. His experience on the streets brought a unique perspective that no consultant could offer. At the end of the day, exhausted but fulfilled, Richard returned to the hotel. Sitting on the soft bed, he took off his new shoes and allowed himself a moment of reflection. In his hands, besides the envelope with his salary, was a card that Mary had discreetly given him before leaving. "It's from a private investigator," she had explained. "If you want to try to locate your daughter." Richard looked out the hotel window, observing the city lights gradually turning on. Somewhere out there, Laura was living her life, perhaps unaware that her father was closer than ever to finding her. The investigator's card weighed in his pocket like a promise of the future. But Richard knew he needed to take it slow. First, he needed to fully rebuild himself, prove to himself and the world that he was capable of starting over. Then perhaps he could try to regain what he had lost. 2 weeks passed since Richard started his work at Almeida Investments. His office, once empty, was now filled with spreadsheets, reports, and colorful post-its with notes. On the wall, a large map of the city marked strategic points where the social reintegration project could act. On that Thursday morning, Richard arrived earlier than usual. He had developed the habit of stopping by Anne's bakery before work, not just for coffee, but to stay in touch with his former reality. It was his way of not losing perspective on what really mattered. "Good morning, Mary," he greeted as he met the HR director in the elevator. "Ready for the board meeting?" Mary nervously adjusted the folder she was carrying. "To be honest, I'm apprehensive. Not all shareholders are enthusiastic about investing so much money in a social project." The conference room on the 30th floor was packed. Executives in expensive suits occupied their chairs with skeptical expressions. Richard, wearing a new but modest suit, felt the evaluative looks on him. Frank opened the meeting with his usual authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to officially present Project New Beginning. Richard Mendez, our new Director of Social Projects, will share the details." Richard stood up, feeling the weight of the moment. The last 2 weeks had been intense, developing a detailed plan that went far beyond simple charity. "Project New Beginning is not just another welfare program," he began, his voice firm. "It's an investment in human capital. Our proposal is to identify people in street situations who, like I was a few weeks ago, have the potential and desire to rebuild their lives." The slides began to pass on the screen, showing numbers, graphs, and projections. Richard explained how the project would work in 3 phases: identification and selection, training and reintegration, and ongoing monitoring. "But why should our company get involved in this?" questioned one of the shareholders, interrupting the presentation. "There are NGOs for this kind of work." Richard smiled, already expecting this question. "Because it's an investment that generates real returns. Beyond the positive social impact, which strengthens our brand, we're creating a unique talent pool. People who know both the corporate world and the reality of the streets. This perspective is invaluable for any company that really wants to understand and impact society." Mary watched admiringly as Richard navigated the difficult questions, with a mixture of business pragmatism and social sensitivity. His personal experience gave weight and credibility to each argument. During the meeting break, as the executives helped themselves to coffee, Richard felt his cell phone vibrate. It was a message from Joe, his former sidewalk companion, who now had a basic phone provided by Richard. "There's a lady here asking for you," the message said. "Says it's important." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. Who could it be? His thoughts immediately flew to his ex-wife, to Laura. Controlling his anxiety, he replied that he would go there at the end of the day. The second part of the meeting was even more intense. The numbers were dissected, the projections questioned. Richard defended each point with the precision of someone who knew both the financial market and the harsh reality of the streets. "If I may," Frank intervened, standing up, "I'd like to share something. 2 weeks ago, when Richard returned my wallet, he wasn't asking for a job or help. He simply did the right thing even when no one was looking. How many of us would do the same in his situation? The silence that followed was eloquent. One by one, the board members began to show support for the project. By the end of the meeting, Project New Beginning had been unanimously approved. "Congratulations," Mary whispered as the executives left the room. "You were brilliant." But Richard barely heard the compliment. His thoughts were focused on the mysterious lady who was looking for him. As soon as possible, he said goodbye to Frank and Mary, promising to return with news the next day. The sun was already setting when Richard arrived at his old sidewalk. Jo was waiting for him anxiously. "She stayed here for hours," he explained. "Said she'd come back tomorrow, seemed to know you well." "What did she look like?" Richard asked, his heart racing. "An elegant lady, must have been about 60. Wore a pearl necklace and—" Richard froze. He knew only one person with that description, Ms. Cecilia, his former secretary from when he was financial director. That night in his hotel room, Richard couldn't sleep. The day's achievements, the project's approval, the board's recognition, seemed distant in the face of the possibility of reconnecting with his past. Lying on the bed, looking at the ceiling, he took out the card of the private investigator that Mary had given him. Maybe it was time to start actively looking for Laura. The universe seemed to be conspiring to reconnect the loose threads of his life. His cell phone rang again. It was Frank. "Richard, sorry to call at this hour, but I just got out of a dinner with some investors. They loved the project and want to expand it to other cities. I think we've created something bigger than we imagined." "Thank you, Frank, but I think tomorrow might be an even more important day." "Why? Did something happen?" Richard hesitated for a moment. "Someone from my past looked for me today, someone who might have news about my daughter." On the other end of the line, Frank was silent for a few seconds. "Do you want me to go with you tomorrow?" "No, thank you. It's something I need to face alone." After hanging up, Richard stood looking out the hotel window, observing the city lights. Somewhere out there, his past and his future seemed about to meet. Tomorrow would bring answers, but for now he allowed himself to simply feel gratitude for another day of new beginnings. The morning seemed to drag on as Richard waited on the sidewalk where, until a few weeks ago, had been his home. He had arrived early, dismissing the driver that Frank insisted on keeping at his disposal. Jo was sitting beside him, sharing a coffee that Anne had prepared especially for the occasion. "You look different, Mr. Richard," Anne observed, who had come out of the bakery to join them. "But you're still the same inside." Richard smiled, adjusting the tie he now wore naturally. It was true. Externally, he had returned to being the executive he once was, but his essence remained unchanged. The lessons learned on the streets were engraved in his soul. Shortly after 9 o'clock, a silver Mercedes parked near the sidewalk. From the driver's seat, an elegant lady stepped out, her white hair perfectly arranged and the pearl necklace shining under the morning sun. Ms. Cecilia hadn't changed much in the last few years. "Richard," she exclaimed, her eyes watering at the sight of him. "My God, it really is you." He stood up to greet her, feeling an emotion he hadn't expected. Miss Cecilia had been more than a secretary during his years as financial director. She was an advisor, a friend. "Miss Cecilia," he replied, accepting the warm hug she offered. "It's been so long." Anne quickly arranged a discreet table in the back of the bakery where they could talk privately. Jo respectfully kept his distance, but his attentive eyes didn't miss a detail of the scene. "I looked for you for so long," Miss Cecilia began, her hands trembling slightly as she held the coffee cup. "After everything happened, well, no one knew your whereabouts." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "They were difficult times, Miss Cecilia. I didn't even want to be found myself." "But now you're back," she smiled, her eyes scanning the well-cut suit he was wearing. "I saw your photo in the newspaper yesterday next to Frank Almeida. I could hardly believe it. The news about Project New Beginning had been published in a small article in the business section. Richard hadn't expected it to reconnect him so quickly with his past. "Miss Cecilia," he hesitated, gathering courage, "do you have any news about Laura?" The lady's smile widened, her hands reaching for something in her purse. "I have more than news, Richard. I've been in touch with her all these years." She took an envelope from her purse, carefully stored in a plastic folder. Inside were photographs. Richard took them with trembling hands. The first photo showed Laura in her school uniform, smiling at the camera. The second at a ballet recital. The third, more recent, showed a 15-year-old teenager with the same expressive eyes he remembered. Does she know you're here?" he asked, his voice choked. Miss Cecilia shook her head. "I thought it best to find you first. Laura never stopped asking about you, you know. Even when Helen, your ex-wife, tried to avoid the subject." Richard gently ran his fingers over his daughter's image. "How is she?" "She's an excellent student. Wants to study medicine. She has your way of analyzing things, always trying to understand. The whys." Miss Cecilia paused. "Helen remarried 2 years ago, but Laura, she always kept a place in her heart for her father." The bakery bell chimed as new customers entered. Anne skillfully directed them away from the table where the important conversation was taking place. "There's something else you need to know," Ms. Cecilia continued, her expression becoming more serious. "Remember Carlos, your former partner?" Richard felt a chill. Carlos had been the main person responsible for his financial ruin, convincing him to make investments that later proved to be fraudulent. "He confessed everything, Richard. A year ago, when he fell ill, he left a notarized statement assuming his responsibility in the scheme that destroyed the company. Your name has been cleared." The revelation hit Richard like a wave. All those years on the streets, all the guilt he had carried, and the truth finally came to light. "Why only now?" he asked, more to himself than to Ms. Cecilia. "Sometimes, time needs to pass for the truth to find its way," she answered softly. "The important thing is that now you can rebuild not only your professional life, but also your family ties." Richard looked out the bakery window, observing the movement. On the street, Joe was still at his post, now talking to some new homeless people who had arrived. Life continued its flow, indifferent to the revelations that were transforming his world at that moment. "She lives in Murrumbee now," Ms. Cecilia commented, handing over a paper with an address written on it. "Helen works for a multinational. Travels a lot. Laura spends a lot of time alone with the housekeeper. Do you think she would accept seeing me?" "I'm sure," Ms. Cecilia smiled. "In fact, she has a piano recital next Saturday. I managed to get 2 tickets. She slid the tickets across the table. Richard took the tickets, feeling the weight of the opportunity in his hands. "Miss Cecilia, I don't even know how to thank you." "Thank me by being the father Laura always knew you were," she replied, standing up. "Now I have to go, I have an appointment, but I'll be waiting for news from you." Before leaving, Miss Cecilia handed another envelope to Richard. "These are all the photos I have of her from these years. I thought you'd like to have them." After she left, Richard remained in the bakery, examining each photograph carefully, trying to recover the lost years through those images. Anne approached, discreetly, leaving another cup of coffee. "Your daughter is beautiful," she commented, peeking at one of the photos. "She has your smile." Richard nodded, unable to contain his emotion. He took out his cell phone and called Mary at the office. "I need a favor," he said as soon as she answered. "Can you help me find a piano teacher? I need to remember some notes before Saturday." On the other end of the line, Mary laughed. "I think I know the perfect person, but you'll have to tell me this story later." Carefully storing the photos and tickets in his briefcase, Richard prepared to return to the office. He had an important meeting with Frank about the expansion of Project New Beginning, but his thoughts were already on Saturday, on the recital, on the reunion he had waited for so long. Before leaving, he went back to where Joe was. "I need you to gather our friends here from the street," he said, handing him a card. "Tomorrow, the first phase of the project begins. You'll be one of the first participants." Joe took the card, with tears in his eyes. "You didn't forget about us." "How could I?" Richard replied. "You taught me the value of true friendship when I had nothing to offer in return." As he walked towards the car waiting for him, Richard felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The past, present, and future finally seemed to align in a perspective of hope. In his pocket, Laura's photos were like a newly discovered treasure, promising a new chapter in his story of new beginnings. Richard's office was buzzing with activity that Thursday. Piles of resumes occupied his desk, each telling the story of someone who, like him, had lost everything but not hope. Mary coordinated the initial interviews for Project New Beginning, while social workers carefully evaluated each case. "Mr. Richard," called Melissa, one of the newly hired social workers, "you need to see this." She placed a candidate's file on his desk. Patricia, 35 years old, former music teacher, lost everything caring for her son with a rare disease. Richard examined the document with renewed interest. Since deciding to relearn piano for Laura's recital, any mention of music caught his attention. "Where is she now?" "In the waiting room. She's the next interview." Patricia entered the room minutes later, carrying with her that characteristic dignity of someone who had known better times. Her eyes, although tired, maintained a glimmer of determination. "Mrs. Patricia," Richard stood up to greet her, "please, have a seat." The interview flowed naturally. Patricia told how she had sold everything, including her grand piano, to pay for her son's treatments. When the boy finally recovered, she was already on the streets, giving private music lessons in exchange for meals. "I still play, you know?" she commented with a sad smile. "There's a public piano at Republic Station. I go there every morning before the station gets too busy." Richard exchanged a significant look with Mary, who was accompanying the interview. "What if I made you a proposal? We need someone to coordinate the cultural area of the project. Music has a transformative power." Patricia's eyes filled with tears. "It would be a dream, but—" She hesitated, looking at her simple clothes. "Mrs. Patricia," Richard gently interrupted, "3 weeks ago I was sleeping on a sidewalk. Today I'm here, directing this project. Sometimes all we need is an opportunity." After the interview, Richard had another important commitment, his first piano lesson in 15 years. Patricia had agreed to be his teacher, starting that very afternoon. The grand piano in the improvised music room at the hotel where Richard was staying seemed intimidating. His hands trembled slightly as he touched the first notes. "Start with something simple," Patricia guided. "Let your fingers remember the way." The notes of Fur-Elise began to flow, hesitant at first, more confident with each measure. Richard closed his eyes, letting the memories come back. He remembered little Laura sitting beside him at the piano, clapping her hands as he played. "You play well," Patricia commented, surprised. "You just need to regain practice." "My daughter will have a recital on Saturday," Richard explained. "So I haven't seen her in 3 years. I want to be able to share something special with her." The afternoon passed quickly between chords and sheet music. When the lesson ended, Richard felt his fingers aching, but his heart was light. Back at the office, he found Frank waiting with news. "The investors love the idea of including a cultural program in the project," he commented, excited. "They want to organize a special presentation for the official launch." Richard smiled, an idea forming in his mind. "What if we did something different? A concert with musicians who are homeless?" Frank raised his eyebrows, interested. "Go on, and Patricia isn't the only artist who lost everything. There are incredible talents on the streets, Frank. People who just need a chance to shine again." Richard's enthusiasm was contagious. Soon, a new dimension of Project New Beginning was starting to take shape. Mary was already making calls, organizing auditions. Joe, who had contacts in various parts of the city, offered to help locate musicians. At the end of that day, Richard returned to the hotel, exhausted but fulfilled. On his bed, he spread out the photos of Laura that Mrs. Cecilia had given him. In one particularly special one, his daughter was at the piano, focused on her performance. His phone rang. It was a message from Mrs. Cecilia. "Laura asked about you today. She said she felt something different in the air, as if you were closer. Little does she know." Richard sat at the hotel piano, letting his fingers glide softly over the keys. The melody that emerged was old, a lullaby he used to play for Laura, to sleep. The notes floated out the open window, mixing with the sounds of the city. In his office on the top floor, Frank watched the lights of New York while listening to Mary report on the day's progress. "You know," he commented, "when I returned that wallet to Richard, I never imagined we'd be about to transform so many lives. Sometimes the biggest projects start with the simplest gestures, Mary replied, smiling. On the sidewalk in front of the hotel, Joe was organizing a small group of people. Tomorrow would be the first official day of the project, and he wanted to make sure everyone was prepared. Among them was a violinist who used to play in the subway, and a young flutist who had lost everything in a fire. The city continued its frantic rhythm, indifferent to the small transformations happening in its bowels. But for that group of people, a new symphony was about to begin, a melody of hope composed of notes of new beginnings and chords of second chances. Richard fell asleep to the distant sound of street music, his dreams cradled by the promise of the reunion that was approaching. In his hands, he still held the photo of Laura at the piano, like a guardian talisman of his new dreams. Saturday dawned with a soft drizzle over New York, creating an almost cinematic scenario. Richard adjusted his burgundy tie for the 10th time, which Mary had helped him choose especially for the occasion. In the hotel mirror, his reflection showed a man transformed not just externally, but inside. "It's time," he said to himself, picking up the small bouquet of white lilies, Laura's favorite flowers, as Mrs. Cecilia had reminded him. The theater where the recital would take place was in an upscale neighborhood in Manhattan. Richard arrived an hour early, his heart beating so hard it seemed to want to escape his chest. In the lobby, other parents arrived with their families, some carrying flowers, all dressed elegantly for the occasion. Mrs. Cecilia was waiting for him at the entrance, elegant as always with her pearl necklace. "You came," she smiled, affectionately adjusting his tie. "Laura is the last performance. Helen is traveling for work, so she doesn't know I'm here?" Richard asked, his voice trembling slightly. "No, I thought it was better this way, but I've been preparing the ground in the last few days, talking about you, reminiscing about old stories. She's always very attentive when your name is mentioned." The theater gradually filled up. Richard sat in the 5th row, a strategic position suggested by Mrs. Cecilia, from where he could see the piano well without being immediately noticed. His hands were sweating as he leafed through the recital program. The presentation started punctually at 5 o'clock. Young talents succeeded each other at the piano, some more confident, others visibly nervous. Richard could barely concentrate on the music, his thoughts fixed on the approaching moment. During an interval, his phone vibrated. It was a message from Frank. "Courage, friend. You deserve this moment." There was also a photo from Joe. The first official day of Project New Beginning had been a success. 20 people had started the training program, including the subway violinist who was now rehearsing for the launch presentation. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the presenter announced, "And now, closing our musical afternoon, Laura Thompson will perform Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven." Richard's heart stopped for a moment. A young woman in a light blue dress walked gracefully to the piano. Her brown hair was tied in an elegant bun, exactly as in the photos Mrs. Cecilia had shown him. But seeing her there, in person, was a completely different experience. Laura sat at the piano with a posture that blended delicacy and determination. Her fingers rested gently on the keys and, after a brief moment of concentration, the first notes of Moonlight Sonata filled the theater. Richard felt silent tears running down his face. The music his daughter was playing was the same one he used to play for her to sleep when she was little. It couldn't be a coincidence. Laura's interpretation was emotional, deep. Each note seemed to carry a message, a story, a longing. Richard closed his eyes, letting himself be carried away by the melody his daughter was creating. At that moment, the 3 years of separation seemed to dissolve in the piano notes. When the last note sounded, the theater erupted in applause. Laura stood up and made a small bow, her eyes shining under the stage lights. That's when it happened. Her gaze, sweeping the audience, met Richard's. Time seemed to freeze. The recognition was instantaneous, as if her heart knew, even before her mind processed it, that her father was there. Laura brought her hand to her lips, her eyes filling with tears. Mrs. Cecilia, who was sitting a few rows behind, quickly moved to the aisle, ready to mediate the moment. But it wasn't necessary. Laura descended from the stage and, ignoring the recital protocols, walked directly towards Richard. "Dad?" Her voice was just a whisper. Richard stood up, the bouquet of lilies trembling in his hands. "Laura, my daughter." They embraced right there in the middle of the theatre, indifferent to the curious looks around them. Years of absence, of longing, of unspoken words dissolved in that embrace. "I knew it," Laura sobbed against his chest. "When I chose Moonlight, Sonata, I felt that you would come." "You played magnificently," Richard replied, his voice choked. "Exactly as I remembered." The buzz in the theatre increased. Other performances needed to continue, but father and daughter remained in their own world. Mrs. Cecilia gently guided them to the lobby, where they could talk with more privacy. "You're different," Laura commented, studying her father's face. "But your eyes are the same?" Richard smiled through the tears. "A lot has changed, sweetheart. I have so much to tell you." "So me too, Dad. I saved every important moment to share with you. I always knew that one day we would meet again." In the theatre lobby, other parents and students passed by hurriedly, some casting curious glances at that reunion scene. But for Richard and Laura, the outside world had disappeared. There were only the words that needed to be said, the years that needed to be recovered, the love that had never ceased to exist. "Would you like to get some hot chocolate?" Laura asked timidly. "There's a cafe nearby where I always go after rehearsals." Richard looked at Mrs. Cecilia, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd love to," he replied, his heart overflowing with joy. As they walked to the cafe, Laura held her father's arm firmly, as if afraid he might disappear again. Richard, in turn, absorbed every detail of that moment: the soft perfume of his daughter, her shy smile, the way she still gestured when speaking, exactly as she did when she was little. The afternoon turned into evening, and father and daughter continued talking, making up for lost time, building bridges over the chasm that had separated them. At the cafe table, between cups of hot chocolate and shared stories, a new chapter was being written, not just for them, but for all who believed in the power of new beginnings. Sunday dawned differently for Richard. He woke up before the alarm, an involuntary smile on his face as he remembered the previous afternoon. His phone already showed a message from Laura. "Good morning, Dad. I still can't believe it wasn't a dream." At Annie's bakery, his usual breakfast gained a special flavor. He shared with her and Joe the details of the reunion, showing the photos they had taken at the cafe. "You're radiant," Annie observed, serving another cup of coffee. "It's as if you've rejuvenated 10 years overnight." Joe, who now wore clean clothes and had a Project New Beginning badge, agreed. "It's true. And to think we knew Mr. Richard in the toughest times." Richard had barely finished his coffee when Frank called. "Sorry to bother you on Sunday, but we need to talk. I'm heading to the bakery." 15 minutes later, Frank arrived, carrying a folder and an enigmatic smile. "How was the reunion?" he asked, sitting down. Richard started to tell, but Frank gently interrupted him. "Actually, I already know everything. Laura called me last night." "Laura called you? How did she—" "Your daughter is impressive, Richard. After you left her at home, she researched everything about Project New Beginning. She found my contact and called me with a proposal." Frank opened the folder, revealing a detailed project. "She wants to create a cultural division within the program, music lessons for children in vulnerable situations, and more. She convinced several colleagues from the conservatory to participate as volunteers." Richard took the project with trembling hands. Laura's neat handwriting filled pages and pages of analyses and proposals. She had inherited from him not only the love for music, but also the capacity for organization and planning. "That's not all," Frank continued. "Helen, your ex-wife, also got in touch. When she learned about the project through Laura, she offered free legal support to help our assisted people regularize their documentation." The mention of Helen made Richard swallow hard. She knows about me?" "She does, and she said that despite everything, she always believed you would find your way back." At that moment, Patricia entered the bakery. Since she started in the project, she had regained her teacher posture. "Sorry to interrupt, but I had to share something." "Amazing. John, that subway violinist, managed to gather a complete string quartet. They're all musicians who are homeless. Frank smiled. Great timing, Patricia. I was just showing Richard Laura's proposal for the project's cultural division. The morning turned into an impromptu meeting. Annie provided more coffee while ideas flowed. Joe contributed with his street experience, identifying locations where there were more artists in need of support. You know what moves me the most? Patricia commented, her eyes shining. Seeing how music can be a bridge. Yesterday during the quartet's rehearsal, people stopped to listen. No one saw homeless people there. They saw musicians, artists. Richard thought of Laura, of how music had been his own bridge of reconnection. Art has that power, he said. It doesn't see social class, doesn't judge appearances. It just touches the soul. His phone vibrated with another message from Laura. Dad, can I stop by the company tomorrow? I want to learn more about the project. Mom said she wants to participate too. Frank, who was reading the message over Richard's shoulder, laughed. I think our project just gained a very special junior consultant. The conversation was interrupted by violin sounds coming from the street. John's quartet had decided to rehearse right there in front of the bakery. The notes of Vivaldi's Spring floated in the air, attracting curious onlookers. That gave me an idea, said Frank, his eyes shining with that characteristic sparkle, when he had a new project in mind. What if we transformed this block into a cultural hub? Annie's bakery is already a natural meeting point. We could have regular performances, music classes. Annie, who was listening attentively to everything, added, I can adapt the backspace for a small classroom. I've always dreamed of doing something beyond selling bread. Richard observed the scene with a mix of emotion and gratitude. In a few square meters, people were gathered who represented different moments of his life. Joe, who accompanied him in the most difficult moments, Annie, who never treated him with less dignity, Frank, who gave him a second chance, Patricia, a symbol. That transformation was possible, and now Laura and Helen also wanted to be part of this story. The universe, in its mysterious wisdom, was not only reconstituting his family, but expanding it in ways he could never imagine. The string quartet continued playing, and more people joined to listen. Among them, Richard recognized some of the first project participants, now in clean clothes and hopeful looks. You know, he said to Frank, when you gave me back my dignity, I never imagined we'd be here, about to transform so many other lives. It wasn't me who gave you back your dignity, Richard, Frank replied. You never lost it. You just needed an opportunity to show the world who you really were. The violin notes mingled with the sounds of the city, creating a unique symphony of transformation and hope. On the sidewalk, where a few weeks ago Richard slept, a new center of possibilities was now being born. His phone vibrated once more. It was a photo of Laura at the piano, rehearsing. The caption read, Preparing something special for the inauguration of the project's cultural division. I love you, Dad, Richard smiled, putting the phone in his pocket. Life, like a great orchestra, sometimes needed time to tune its instruments, but when it found its harmony, the music it produced was capable of transforming the world. Saturday dawned with an extraordinarily blue sky over New York. The Almeida Investments Auditorium, normally reserved for shareholder meetings, had been transformed into a concert hall. On the stage, a grand piano shared space with other instruments, while in the lobby, the aroma of Annie's bread mingled with that of gourmet coffee served on elegant trays. Richard was adjusting his tie in front of the mirror in the improvised music room when Laura came running in. Dad, it's almost time, and there's someone special who wants to see you before the event starts. Before he could ask who it was, Richard heard a voice he hadn't heard in more than 15 years. Always late for the big moments, aren't you, little brother? He turned quickly to find his older brother, Edward, standing at the door. His hair was now grey, but he had the same playful smile as always. Behind him, Helen and Laura smiled, complicit in the surprise. Edward? But how? Laura found me, his brother replied, advancing for a tight hug. My niece is persistent when she wants something. She tracked down my office in London and wouldn't rest until she convinced me to come. Richard could hardly believe it. His brother, who had moved to London years before his financial crisis, was the only family he had left besides Laura. Distance and problems had broken communication between them. That's not all, Helen added, approaching. Edward has a proposal for the project. He develops similar work in London with immigrants in vulnerable situations. More surprises were interrupted by the sound of music coming from the auditorium. The event was about to begin. John's string quartet was already in position, and the first guests were taking their seats. Frank took the stage to officially open the ceremony. The auditorium was packed. Authorities, businessmen, journalists, and most importantly, dozens of project participants and their families. 2 months ago, Frank began, an act of honesty changed my perspective on the real value of business. Today, Project New Beginning ceases to be just an Almeida Investments initiative to become a movement of social transformation. The presentations began with John's quartet playing Rhapsody in Blue. From the audience, Richard proudly watched, as those musicians, once invisible on the city streets, now shone under the spotlights. Patricia conducted a choir formed by project participants, their voices united in a moving version of New York, New York. Annie from the bakery cried silently in the front row, while Joe, impeccable in his new suit, recorded everything on a tablet for the project's social media. Then came the moment Laura had been secretly rehearsing for. She went up on stage, with Richard sitting together at the piano. Father and daughter began to play an original composition, created especially for the occasion. The notes told a story of loss, hope, and new beginnings, bringing tears to many eyes in the audience. But the real surprise was yet to come. As they played, dozens of project participants began to enter the stage, each carrying a lit candle. Among them was Edward, who took the microphone. "This music," he announced, "will be the official anthem of Project New Beginning, not only here, but also in London, Paris, and Madrid, where we have just established partnerships for international expansion of the program." Richard almost missed the notes when he heard that. Laura smiled without stopping playing while her uncle continued. "My brother taught me many years ago that true wealth lies in transforming lives. Today, he proves it once again." The governor, present at the event, announced that the project would be adopted as public policy, with state support for its expansion. Businessmen in the audience were already articulating to create branches of the program in their own companies. When the music ended, the applause was deafening. Richard hugged Laura, both too emotional to speak. Helen joined them, followed by Edward. There on stage, a family reconnected while celebrating the transformation of so many other lives. At the cocktail party that followed the event, stories of overcoming mingled with plans for the future. The saxophonist Laura had discovered at the last minute enchanted those present with his smooth jazz. Anna proudly served her artisanal breads, now in high demand by the businessmen present. "You know what's most incredible?" Frank commented, approaching Richard with 2 glasses of champagne. "It all started with a lost wallet." Richard smiled, observing the scene around him. Joe was explaining the operation of the project to interested journalists. Patricia was discussing the expansion of the cultural program with a Secretary of Culture. Laura and Helen were animatedly talking with Edward about international plans. "No, my friend," Richard replied. "It started with people who didn't lose the ability to see the value in each other." Outside the auditorium, the city continued its frantic Saturday rhythm. But something had changed. On the sidewalk where it all began, a banner announced the future construction of the New Beginning Cultural Center. The music coming from the auditorium reached the street, inviting other dreamers to believe that there is always a new chance to start over. Laura approached her father, holding his hand. "Shall we play once more?" Richard nodded, and together they returned to the piano. The notes they created echoed not only through the auditorium, but throughout the city, carrying a message of hope for all who needed to believe that new beginnings are possible, that dignity is never lost, and that true wealth lies in the ability to transform lives. Dear listeners, we hope that Richard's story and the New Beginning Project have touched your hearts. To continue this journey of transformation, we've prepared a special playlist with equally inspiring stories. Find it here on the left side of the video. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity and beauty of life. Tell us in the comments, what was the moment that touched you? the most. And remember, sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the chance to start over. Until next time.